evangelistic methodology that someone laid out before you to guarantee your salvation. My dear friend, as the pastor mentioned earlier, I spent a great deal of my life in Latin America where a great preponderance of the people believed themselves saved because they were baptized as infants. And the modern evangelical in America looks at that and they go, how could anybody be so blind to think that they're saved because they were baptized as an infant? That's absolutely absurd. I mean, these people need the gospel. The same thing, the exact same thing is done here in America in the evangelical community. Only it's not infant baptism. It's, well, I prayed a prayer. I prayed a prayer. I did that. You did what? And do you think it's the unbeliever's fault that he's repeating this language? No, it's the fault of the people of God, and especially the teachers and preachers among the community of faith. You know him, but does he know you? Then he goes on and he says, depart from me. You know, for most people, if most people were to be true, hearing depart from me wouldn't really bother them that much, to be honest with you. They just don't want to depart from heaven. But they'd be happy to depart from Jesus. I always make this statement. Everybody wants to go to heaven. They just don't want God to be there when they get there. You see, and that's the way I hear fundamentalist, evangelical, Baptist preaching today. And I'm a Baptist. You can hold that against me if you want. But I am a Baptist. And I'm not the one that moved. They did. But I want to tell you something. You don't want to go that nasty old hell, do you? What, are you trying to get them saved based on self-preservation? You set a field on fire and every venomous snake in that field will run away from that fire, but when it does, it's still a venomous snake. The question is not, do you want to go to heaven or do you want to escape hell? The question is, has God so worked in your heart that you want God? Most people want a heaven. They don't want Jesus to be there, God to be there, anything. Don't you understand the desire for heaven, for a utopia, is what political theory is all about. Everyone's striving for that. Sure, I'd love to go to a place where there's no pain and everything is beautiful and I get what I want. But that's not heaven. Heaven it's Him. I was talking to a guy one time and he got very mad at me and I couldn't figure out why. Because after listening to him, after witnessing to him, I listened to him for a while and then he asked me what I thought and I said, well, I think you're squarely on the road to hell. He got very mad at me. I said, why are you mad? He said, why wouldn't I? You just told me I'm going to hell. I said, well, you asked my opinion. I mean, why wouldn't I get mad? You just told me I'm going to hell. I said, sir, listen to what you have told me. I asked you, do you desire to worship Him? You said no. I said, sir, do you desire to do His will? You said no. I said, sir, do you desire to fellowship with the people of God? You said no. So I just thought you'd be happier in hell. Because what do you actually think heaven is? It is a relationship with Him. It is the revelation, the unveiling of Him. And the fellowship of the saints. And if you don't want that here, you don't want that there. You just want to go to a place where you won't suffer, but you don't want God. And that's pretty much American heaven right there. So depart from me. Now, he says this, you who practice lawlessness. Now, lawlessness, to live without law, or to live as though there was no law at all. Now, I want to sum this up for you for what he's saying, and it's terrifying. Because we already know these people consider themselves disciples, and they call Jesus Lord, Lord. But their life is not marked by the will of God. And so to sum this up, this is what's being said. Depart from me. Those of you who considered yourself my disciples and even emphatically declared me to be Lord, but you did not commune with me, and you lived as though I never gave you a law to obey. I just described American Christianity. The 60 or 70% of the people in this country who believe that they're converted because one time in their life they prayed a prayer. Now he goes on, he says, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Here is a lesson in the need to interpret Scripture in its context. I have heard this passage preached almost every time I've heard it preached this way. As believers, we need to build our life on the rock so that when the storms of life come, we will be solid and established and firm. And if we're not careful and we build our houses as believers on the sand and not upon the commandments of God, then when the troubled times come, we will be at great loss and we will be shaken and have no foundation. That's how it's usually preached. That's not what it means at all. Not at all. He's not talking about believers having a sure foundation. He is drawing a contrast that he's been drawing this entire passage. Now let's go back to verse 13. What do we see? There is a narrow gate, and then that leads to life. And we assume there's an opposing gate that leads to destruction. There is a narrow way that leads to life and a broad way that leads to destruction, eternal destruction. There is a good tree that bears good fruit that is pruned and becomes more fruitful. There is a bad tree that produces bad fruit and it's cut down and thrown into the fire. There are those who say, Lord, Lord, and do the will of the Father and enter into the kingdom. And there are those who say, Lord, Lord, but do not do the will of the Father, and they do not enter into the kingdom. There are those who hear the words of Christ and His gospel, and they build their life upon that, and when the floods of God's judgment come, they are saved. And there are those who only hear the words of Christ but do not act upon them. They do not do the will of God. They do not build their life upon this gospel. And when the floods of God's judgment come, they are destroyed. That is the context. Look how we can take a text and just mess it all around. He's talking here not about rewards or a good life or even your best life now. What he's talking about is eternal salvation and eternal damnation. And he ends this marvelous Christian manifesto of the Sermon on the Mount with this tremendous warning. Do you see? Do you see? Several years ago, there was a film about a boy who saw dead people. And because of that, his whole life was just turned upside down. Well, the man of God sees lost people going to hell. And many of them who have sat under conservative, evangelical, fundamental preaching, going to hell because the gospel has been reduced down to nothing. Let me just give you the typical gospel invitation. Do you know you're a sinner? And sometimes we say it in kind of a laughing way. We're all sinners. And we also want to throw in there, we are all sinners, so they won't think that we're trying to isolate them. Well, you know, we're all sinners, don't you? I was actually told in my preaching class that when I preach about sin, I should say we instead of you. But I decided, hey, I'm the one preaching. I'm going to talk about you. You're a sinner. I'll put the spotlight on the sinner. We say, hey, we're sinners. We're all sinners, don't you? Well, that's like that doctor I was talking about walking into my office and say to my mother, who died of cancer last year, hey, Barb, you got cancer. If it would be immoral for him to be so trite about something that can only take the physical life, how can we be so trite about something that takes the eternal life? Hey, we know we're all sinners. That's not the way you do it. And then if they say, well, yeah, I know that. They've told you nothing. Absolutely nothing. Go ask the devil if he's a sinner. Well, yes, I am. Very good one at that, or very bad one, depending on how you look at it. You've done nothing. It means nothing. But we go, well, you're a sinner, don't you? If they say yes, we go on to step number 2. Want to go to heaven? If they say, well, yeah. Well, then would you like to pray and ask Jesus to come into your heart? Well, sure. Won't take very long, will it? No, 5 minutes of your time. And then they pray that prayer. Did Jesus come in? Well, I'm not sure. Of course He did, because if He didn't come in, He's a liar because He promised to come in. Oh, okay. And you've made a twofold son of hell, that's what you've done. The question is not, sir, do you know, or ma'am, do you know you're a sinner? The question is this: has God so worked in your heart through the gospel that I've preached to you that the sin you once loved, you now hate? Have you changed your mind with regard to what you are before God? Have you changed your mind with regard to what sin is? And have you come to disdain something of what you once boasted about? Do you see your wretchedness before God? I've never seen this before. The things that you told me about God's justice and about man's depravity, I never knew that it was like this. Well, what do you think, sir? Well, I'm lost. I really mean that. I'm lost. I can see that. Now, the next question. Do you want to go to heaven? What kind of question is that? Jesus did not walk around asking people if they wanted to go to heaven. Nor did the apostles walk around going, do you want to go to heaven? They didn't do that. The question is not, do you want to go to heaven? Because as I said, everybody wants to go to heaven. The devil would like to go back to heaven as long as he didn't have to bow his knee to God. So that's not the question, is it? The question is, since you've heard the preaching of the gospel, and you've seen something of who God is, and seen something of your depravity and your filth, and your lack of merit and virtue, and the rightfulness of God judging you. After you've seen the cross, the things I've told you about God so loving the world, He sent His only begotten Son, do you have a new desire in your heart? Do you love Him? Do you want Him? Do you desire Him? Has something been birthed in there? Well, I can't really explain it, but this God you're talking about, I never knew, that He would send His Son for me. He really did that. And He's so holy and He's just. I understand that. But knowing what I am now and knowing what He did for me, yeah, I want Him. I don't really know what that means, but there's just this, I've just been so stupid. I've lived my whole life without this God. Well, would you like to pray and receive Jesus right now? No. That language is not in the Bible. But rather, sir, the Bible commands you